30 days after Continental Freight Systems fired him, the trucks stopped moving. All of them. Across 11 states, GPS pins froze mid-route. Warehouse doors sat open with nothing coming through. In the Denver Operations Center, screens bled red, and nobody in the room, not the new consultants Gary Nolan had flown in from Chicago, not the engineers hunched over terminals since 4 in the morning, could tell Emily Sanders why. Then, buried in an error log nobody could parse, a single line surfaced, a name none of them recognized. David Turner. Emily read it twice before she asked, "Who is that?" Before this story gets any crazier, subscribe. People like David deserve to be remembered, not ignored. Keep watching to see how one quiet termination brought down a national freight network and what it actually took to undo it. 30 days earlier, David Turner sat in the basement of the Continental Freight Systems building, 2 floors below the glass and the good coffee, fixing a printer nobody upstairs still existed. He wore the same navy polo the company issued to support staff, no name badge beyond a first name and a barcode. He'd worked there 8 years. Almost nobody could have told you what he did before that. At 9 that morning, an all-staff meeting went out. Mandatory meeting, main auditorium. 10 o'clock. David went because everyone went. He sat in the back row, arms crossed loosely, watching Gary Nolan take the stage in a suit that fit too well for a man who'd been VP of Operations for exactly 14 months. Continental is entering a new era, Gary said, and the words came out smooth, rehearsed. We've partnered with Ridgeline Consulting Group to modernize our infrastructure from the ground up. That means new tools, new processes, and yes, some restructuring. The restructuring list went up on the screen behind him. 41 names. David's was 17th. He didn't react. He learned a long time ago that the moment you flinch in a room like that, people remember it later. He sat still, read his own name once, and then looked down at his hands. Beside him, a younger technician named Ray Doss leaned over and whispered, "That's brutal, man." They didn't even say why. David just nodded. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't come out sounding bitter, and bitter wasn't something he let himself be in rooms where people remembered things later. Nobody explained why. Nobody from HR pulled him aside to talk about severance formulas or transition packages tailored to 8 years of service. A junior HR coordinator handed him a folder at his desk an hour later and told him security would walk him out at noon. Sandra Fields watched it happen from the hallway outside her office. She'd been at Continental 11 years, long enough to remember David from before he was invisible, though she couldn't have said exactly what before meant. She almost said something. She didn't. Gary Nolan was standing 20 feet away, and Sandra had a mortgage and a son starting college in the fall. At noon, David carried a small box, a coffee mug, a photo of his daughter, a charger, past the security desk and out into the Denver cold. The guard at the front, a heavy-set man named Curtis, who'd worked the desk longer than David had worked upstairs, said, "Take care of yourself, Turner," in a voice that meant it. David nodded once, the box balanced on his hip, and didn't trust himself to say much back. He didn't look back at the building. He got in his truck. If they can erase 8 years with one meeting, the least we can do is not scroll away, subscribe. Sat for a minute with the engine off, and then drove to pick up Maddie from school early. She was 9, hair in a ponytail that had come half undone by 2 in the afternoon, backpack heavier than she was. She climbed into the truck and said, "You're early. Wanted to see you. Is that a lie?" "A little bit." She studied him for a second, the way kids do when they're deciding to push. She didn't push. That night they made spaghetti together, her stirring the sauce standing on a step stool, him not mentioning Continental once. After she went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the folder HR had given him and didn't open it for a long time. Sandra Fields spent the better part of the next week processing severance files for the 41 names on that list. Most of it was routine, years of service, unused vacation days, COBRA paperwork.
David Turner's file was different, and it took her 2 days to understand why. Continental calculated severance based on continuous tenure, which meant pulling personnel records back to a person's original hire date. David's hire date wasn't 8 years ago, it was 12 years. The system had him down as a support technician with 8 years in that specific role, but underneath it, buried in an old scanned folder from the company's acquisition period, was a different document entirely, an intellectual property assignment agreement dated 8 years ago, the year a private equity firm called Brightwell Capital bought what was then a scrappy startup called Rootworks and folded it into Continental Freight Systems. The agreement assigned all rights to a piece of software called Atlas Core to Continental in exchange for a settlement figure and continued employment. The author listed on the patent filing attached to it was David J. Turner. A confidentiality clause, standard for the acquisition, prohibited public attribution of authorship without written consent from both parties. Sandra read it 3 times, then a 4th, checking the signature line against the David Turner she just processed severance paperwork for, as if there might be 2 men with that name working the same basement hallway. There weren't. The employee ID matched. The social security number matched. 12 years ago, a 26-year-old software engineer had built the routing engine for a scrappy little freight startup out of a garage office, and 8 years ago, when the big money came in and swallowed the company whole, he traded his name on that invention for a settlement check and a quiet desk job nobody would ever ask questions about.
Atlas Core wasn't some old side project. It was the system that ran the entire company. Every route, every dock assignment, every load calculation, still humming along 12 years after a 26-year-old engineer had written its first working version in a garage office in Lakewood. She sat there with the folder open, coffee going cold, and thought about David Turner fixing a printer in the basement, while the man who ran their operations division called their infrastructure outdated. She didn't call anyone. She couldn't. The confidentiality clause bound her to, technically, and Gary Nolan had made it clear in dozens small ways that Sandra's job security depended on staying inside her lane. He'd said so much 3 months earlier, standing in her doorway after a routine audit flagged a vendor discrepancy. "You process the paperwork, Sandra. You don't have to understand it." She'd smiled and nodded, and hated herself a little for it. She made a copy of the file anyway, slid it into a folder at the back of her desk drawer underneath a stack of expired parking permits nobody would ever look through, and told herself she'd figure out what to do with it later. Later felt safer than now. Later always did. 3 days after David's last day, a delivery truck in the Denver depot pulled up to Bay 11 instead of Bay 4. Nobody flagged it as anything more than a fluke. Ridgeline Consulting arrived that same week with laptops, lanyards, and a deck titled Continental Forward. Their lead engineer, a confident man named Patrick Kessler, walked the operations floor explaining how they were going to clean up the legacy codebase and modernize the routing architecture within the quarter. What Patrick and his team didn't know, because nobody had told them and nothing in the documentation said so, was that Atlas Core wasn't built the way modern systems were built. It had grown organically over 12 years, patched and extended by one person who understood every dependency because he'd written every dependency. There was no design document explaining why the failover logic checked inventory in a specific order, or why certain warehouse codes triggered manual override flags instead of automated ones. David knew those answers the way a person knows the layout of their own house in the dark. Nobody else did. Ridgeline started optimizing. They rewrote the routing tables in clean, modern code, deleted what looked like redundant conditional statements, and congratulated themselves on a Friday status update about reducing technical debt by 19%. Nobody on the team had asked why those conditionals existed in the first place, because nothing in the documentation told them, and the one person who could have told them was 3 weeks gone and unreachable. Within a week, small errors surfaced, a shipment routed to the wrong regional hub, a load manifest duplicated across 2 trucks, and a driver named Ali Banks sitting outside a locked warehouse in Amarillo for 40 minutes because the system had scheduled his delivery to a dock that had been decommissioned 2 years earlier.
and for reasons nobody upstairs could explain, still existed as a valid destination in the old routing tables. Emily Sanders got her first flagged report on a Tuesday morning. Minor, contained, nothing alarming. She forwarded it to Gary with a note asking him to keep an eye on it. Gary told her it was expected. You don't modernize a 12-year-old system without some turbulence. He said, "You don't modernize a 12-year-old system without some turbulence," he said again, like the sentence had been focus grouped. "I've got Ridgeline doing nightly stability reports. I'll forward you tonight's." "Send it to the whole board," Emily said, "not just me." A flicker crossed Gary's face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. "Sure," he said, "of course." Something in the certainty of his answer didn't sit right with her, though she couldn't name what. She'd trusted Gary since she took over for her father 2 years earlier. He'd been at Continental 14 months longer than she'd been running it, and she'd leaned on that experience more than she liked to admit. Walking out of his office, she found herself less reassured than before she walked in. That night, working late, she pulled up an archived recording from an old technical review meeting, part of an unrelated audit her assistant had queued for her. 4 years old, low resolution, mostly people she recognized. In the corner of the frame, barely in shot, stood a man in a support uniform saying nothing, watching the room with an attention nobody else in the meeting seemed to notice him giving. She paused the video, frowned at the frame, and couldn't place why his face snagged at her. She closed the laptop and went home.
The next morning, a folded piece of paper sat on her desk, unsigned, in handwriting she didn't recognize. 7 words, "Ask who wrote Atlas Core originally." She read it twice, the same way she'd read David's name on a screen 30 days later, though she didn't know that yet. She put the paper in her desk drawer and told herself she'd look into it when things calmed down. Things did not calm down. 9 days later, at 6:40 in the morning, Atlas Core went down completely. It wasn't a single failure, it was a cascade. A routing table Ridgeline had cleaned up the week before triggered a failover sequence that no longer matched the manual override logic buried 3 layers beneath it. And once that mismatch hit, the entire national dispatch system locked into a loop it couldn't resolve itself. Trucks already en route kept moving, guided by cache data, until they didn't. New shipments had nowhere to go. By 7:30, the Denver operations floor looked like a building during a fire drill nobody had scheduled. Emily got the call at her apartment, still in yesterday's clothes, and was in the building by 8. The operations floor looked like nothing she'd seen there before. Phones ringing on every desk, dispatch coordinators standing instead of sitting. A wall-mounted map of the country lit up almost entirely in red, where it should have been a scattered handful of green dots moving steadily east and west. Patrick Kessler and his team were standing over 3 separate terminals, talking over each other, none of them able to explain what had actually broken, only that it had broken everywhere at once. Gary hovered near Emily's shoulder, saying words like temporary and contained that didn't match anything on the screens. "How many trucks are stopped right now?" Emily asked, flat. Nobody answered right away. Finally, a dispatch lead said, "Best guess, ma'am, around 4,000. Emily closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them and went to her office. By 10, Emily had had enough of words that didn't match screens. She went back to her office, opened the drawer, and found the folded note still sitting where she'd left it. Ask who wrote Atlas Core originally. She didn't call anyone from IT, she drove. She found the address through an old expense report reimbursement file David had once submitted mileage for, an off-site meeting years back, and the address hadn't been updated since. Lakewood, a modest street lined with maples just starting to turn. She parked, sat for a second, gathering whatever nerve the morning had left her, and walked up to the door. David opened it in a flannel shirt, sleeves pushed up, a dish towel still in one hand. He looked at her, the CEO of the company that had walked him out 3 weeks earlier, standing on his porch, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Miss Sanders?" "Emily," she said. "Can I come in?" Behind him, Maddie appeared in the hallway, curious, half hidden behind the doorframe the way kids do when they sense something adult happening. David glanced back at her, then at Emily, and something in his face closed. I don't think that's a good idea, he said. The whole system's down, Emily said. National. 4,000 trucks stopped on the road right now. I don't know what's happening, and nobody in that building can tell me. I heard, David said. I don't work there anymore. I know. I'm asking anyway. You fired me a month ago without a word of explanation, and now you're on my porch asking me to fix the thing you fired me for building. His voice wasn't angry, it was tired, which was somehow worse. I didn't know what I was firing, Emily said. I know that's not a good enough answer. It's the true one. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might actually say yes. Then he shook his head, quiet and final. I'm sorry, I've got my daughter. He closed the door gently, not slamming it, which somehow made it worse. Emily stood on the porch for a second before walking back to her car, the maples rustling overhead, the whole weight of a broken national network sitting in her chest with nowhere to go. She drove back to the office with more questions than she had arrived with, and one thought she couldn't shake. The man who'd been fired without an explanation had just been more composed about the whole thing than she was. Back at Continental, she found Sandra in the HR wing, still at her desk well past 6 o'clock. Emily closed the door behind her. I need you to tell me what you know about David Turner. All of it. Sandra's hands went still on her keyboard. Why? Because I drove to his house tonight and he wouldn't come back, and something about the way he said it made me think he had every right not to. Sandra hesitated exactly as long as it took to decide. The mortgage and the son starting college didn't matter as much as she'd told herself they did. She opened her desk drawer and slid the folder across. Emily read it standing up, then sat down halfway through, then read it again. The IP assignment, the patent filing, the confidentiality clause. 12 years of a system built by one person who Continental had, 8 years ago, quietly agreed to erase from its own history in exchange for a settlement and a support desk job. Does Gary know any of this? Emily asked. I don't think he knew who David was, Sandra said carefully. I don't think that's why he was on the list. I think he was just a name in a headcount reduction Gary needed to hit a number. Emily sat with that for a second, the idea that the man who might have saved them was erased not by malice, but by a spreadsheet nobody bothered to double-check, almost worse somehow. But there's something else, Sandra said, and this was the part she hadn't planned on saying out loud, the part she'd been sitting on since a vendor onboarding form crossed her desk 2 weeks ago. Ridgeline Consulting, the parent entity on their contract paperwork, is called Coldwater Strategic Partners. I processed a background check for their principal for vendor compliance last month. She paused. His last name is Nolan, Trent Nolan, Gary's brother-in-law. Emily felt something settle into place, cold and certain. Gary brought in his own family's firm and signed the contract himself. No competitive bid. I flagged it in the system at the time. It got overridden 2 days later. Sign-off from Gary's office directly. Why didn't you push it further? Sandra's jaw tightened, not from anger at the question, but from 3 years of swallowing versions of it, because the last person who pushed something like that past Gary was reassigned to the Tucson warehouse inside a month.
I have a kid starting college. I'm not proud of that. I'm telling you now. You're telling me now, Emily said, which is more than most people would have done at all. Emily didn't say anything for a moment. Then she picked up the folder, tucked it under her arm, and said, Thank you, Sandra. I mean that. She drove back to Lakewood that same night. It was past 8 when she knocked again, and this time David opened the door already half expecting her, like he'd known she wasn't done. I'm not here as your CEO. Before he could speak, Emily said, I'm here because I fired you for something I didn't do, and I let a man use your absence to profit off a contract that's now taken down an entire national system. I'm sorry. I should have known who was in my own building. David studied her face in the porch light for a long moment. Behind him, Maddie's voice called out asking who was there, and he answered without turning around. Nobody, baby. Go finish your show. He stepped outside and closed the door softly behind him. You want me to fix it? It wasn't a question. I want to understand what's actually broken first, and then, yes, if you're willing. David looked past her toward a city that had spent 8 years walking past him without knowing what he'd built it on. "I didn't do this for credit," he said quietly. "I did it because I was 26 and I liked building things. I never asked to disappear. Somebody decided that was easier for everybody." "It wasn't easier for you," Emily said. He almost smiled at that. "No, it wasn't." "There's more," Emily said, and told him about Trent Nolan, about the no-bid contract, about a licensing structure buried in a vendor agreement that she didn't fully understand yet, but that had her stomach in knots. "I think Gary knew this would happen, or close enough to it. I think somebody stood to profit from your absence, and I let it happen because I didn't ask enough questions about a man I inherited instead of hired." David was quiet for a while, turning something over. 12 years I built that system alone. 8 of them, I watched it from a basement, and I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit as long as it kept working. But somebody just tried to break it on purpose for money and use my own work as the excuse. His voice hardened just slightly. "That part matters to me." He was quiet for a moment, looking back at the house, at the light in the front window where his daughter sat watching cartoons, unaware that the entire spine of a company was being negotiated 10 feet from her. "I'll come look," David said finally. "Not for Continental. There's a lot of drivers out there tonight who didn't do anything wrong." Emily nodded, throat tight in a way she didn't examine too closely. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," David said. "You haven't seen what they did to my code." They drove back into Denver together, mostly in silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable so much as full of 2 people who had, in the space of a single day, gone from stranger and statistic to something neither of them had a name for yet. The operations floor at 11 o'clock that night looked like a hospital waiting room during a mass casualty event. Too many people, not enough answers. Everyone talking at once and nobody listening. David walked in wearing the same flannel he'd answered the door in, and for a second the room didn't register who he was. Then Patrick Kessler, exhausted and out of ideas, looked up and said, "Who's this?" "He wrote the system," Emily said. "Give him a terminal." David sat down at an empty workstation, cracked his knuckles once out of habit, and started typing. He didn't explain what he was doing. He didn't need to. Watching him work was its own kind of explanation. The way his hands moved without hesitation through code nobody else in the building could read, pausing only to mutter things under his breath like he was arguing with a much younger version of himself. Patrick Kessler hovered for a while, trying to keep up, asking questions David answered in clipped half-sentences that assumed a familiarity with the system Patrick simply didn't have. After 20 minutes, Patrick backed off and let him work in silence, which was the smartest thing he'd done all night. "You built the failover logic to check the manual override queue before the automated one," Patrick finally said, half to himself, staring at a chain of function calls on the second monitor. "Why would you do that?" "Because automated systems fail quiet," David said, not looking up. "Manual overrides fail loud. I wanted the loud failure first every time, so a human being would see it before the whole thing cascaded." He tapped the screen once. "Nobody documented that because I was the documentation. That was the mistake, not the code." Emily stayed. She pulled a chair near his terminal, not close enough to hover, close enough to be present. And around 1 in the morning she got up without a word and came back with 2 cups of coffee from the machine down the hall. She set one beside his keyboard and said nothing else. He glanced at it, then at her, and gave the smallest nod before going back to the screen. Hours passed that way, David working, Emily present, the room around them slowly thinning out as consultants gave up and went home one by one, mumbling apologies nobody asked for, until it was mostly just the 2 of them in the hum of servers in a nearly empty building. Outside the windows, Denver's skyline sat dark except for a handful of office lights and the red blink of aircraft warning beacons on the taller buildings. Every so often, David would stop, rub his eyes, and stare at a line of code like it had personally wronged him, and Emily learned not to ask what was wrong, only to wait. Around 3:30, David found what he was looking for, and his hands went still on the keyboard. "There," he said. Emily leaned in.
On screen was a block of code appended to the emergency patch Ridgeline had pushed the week before, a licensing dependency that, once triggered by the failover collapse, would lock Atlas Core's core routing modules behind an activation key Continental didn't own, a key that belonged, according to the file metadata, to Coldwater Strategic Partners. They didn't just break it, David said slowly. They built in a reason you'd have to buy your way out. If I hadn't come back tonight, in about 18 hours this whole system locks for good, and the only thing that unlocks it is a contract with your VP's brother-in-law's company. Emily stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling something between fury and vindication settle in her chest.
Can you stop it? Already did, David said, nodding at a line he'd just commented out. But you're going to want this logged, time-stamped before I touch anything else. He pulled the raw server logs, the original patch file, the metadata trail, everything onto a drive Emily handed him without being asked. Neither of them said much else. By 4 in the morning, trucks that had been frozen for 22 hours started moving again, one route at a time, the dispatch board slowly filling back in with green instead of red. Emily watched the board change and felt, for the first time in weeks, like she could breathe. 2 days later, the Continental Freight Systems Board convened an emergency session, 12 people around a table that had spent the last month approving budgets without asking hard enough questions. Emily stood at the head of it, David beside her, out of place in a support desk polo among tailored suits, unbothered by it in a way that made the room notice him more, not less. Gary sat near the far end, jaw tight, trying to look like a man confident in his own innocence. Emily didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She laid out the timeline plainly, the head count reduction that had, without anyone's intent, removed the one person capable of understanding Atlas Core's undocumented architecture, the no-bid contract Gary personally signed with a firm owned in part by his brother-in-law, the emergency patch that had, whatever else it was, embedded a licensing lock timed to force Continental into a far more expensive replacement contract. "I'm not accusing anyone of planning the outage," Emily said. "I think that part was an accident, born of a system nobody bothered to understand. But the patch that would have made that outage permanent and profitable for a company Gary Nolan has a financial relationship with, that wasn't an accident. That was a decision made after the fact, when the crisis was already public, to make sure it stayed broken." David spoke once when a board member asked him directly whether the lock could have been unintentional. "I've read a lot of code in my life. That wasn't a bug. Bugs don't come with somebody else's license key attached." Harriet Doyle leaned forward. "Mr. Nolan, did you or did you not sign the Ridgeline contract without putting it out for competitive bid?" Gary said, "I had emergency authority under the operations charter. Time was a factor." "Time for what, exactly?" Harriet asked. "The layoffs happened first. The outage happened 3 weeks later. What emergency were you responding to when you signed with your own brother-in-law's firm?" Gary didn't have an answer that survived contact with the room. He tried anyway, something about industry standard practices and long-standing relationships, but the words came out thinner each time, and by the third sentence, even the board members who'd liked him stopped meeting his eyes. Gary tried to argue that the infrastructure was outdated, that any competent modern system wouldn't have been vulnerable in the first place, that blame belonged to whoever let a 12-year-old code base run unsupervised for so long. Nobody in the room missed the irony of him saying it in front of the man who'd built that code base and had been let go a month earlier. The vote came fast once it came, 8-1. Harriet Doyle, the lone abstention, pending her own review of the documents. Gary's employment was terminated before lunch. Legal was already drafting a referral to the district attorney's office regarding the undisclosed vendor relationship and the licensing lock, which, whatever else it was, looked a great deal like extortion dressed up as a service contract. David stood at the back of the room as it emptied, watching people who'd walked past him in a basement hallway for 8 years suddenly needing to shake his hand to say they'd always thought there was something different about him, to ask if they remembered him from the cafeteria. He was polite about it. He shook the hands, said the names back correctly, and didn't linger on any of it. Emily found him by the elevators. "You didn't have to stay for that part," she said. "I wanted to see it land," David admitted. 12 years is a long time to not exist in a room. Does it feel different existing in it now? He considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things. "Ask me in a month," he said. "Right now, it mostly just feels loud."
Down on the operations floor below them, the dispatch board glowed steady and green, hub after hub after hub, the whole country's freight moving again in a rhythm nobody but David fully understood, and for the first time nobody had to pretend otherwise. The offer came 3 days later, delivered in person rather than by email, which David noticed and appreciated without saying so. Chief Technology Officer, full authorship credit on Atlas Core, retroactive and permanent with the old confidentiality clause formally dissolved, a seat, if you wanted it, on the technical steering committee that would decide how the company handled its next decade of infrastructure. David didn't answer right away. He sat across from Emily in her office, an office that until a week ago he'd never once set foot in, and turned the folder over in his hands without opening it. "It's not about the title," he finally said. Or the money.
I need to know this doesn't happen again. Not to me and not to whoever's in that basement in 5 years that nobody bothers to ask about. I can't promise a company never makes a mistake like this again, Emily said, honestly. But I can promise you're not going to be the mistake anyone quietly buries this time. That's a big promise for a CEO who's had the job 2 years, David said, not unkindly. It's the only kind worth making, Emily said. He thought about that for a while. Long enough that Emily didn't fill the silence, which he noticed too. "Give me a few days," he said. "I've got someone at home I need to talk to it about it first." That night, Maddie sat on the kitchen counter while David made grilled cheese, swinging her feet, peppering him with questions he mostly dodged. "So you built the whole computer thing? The one on the news? 12 years ago, before you were born. That's basically forever. Feels like it some days. Are you going to be like famous now?" David laughed, flipping the sandwich. "I don't think fixing a server makes you famous, Bug. Grandma said it was on the local news." Grandma exaggerates. Maddie considered this with the seriousness only a 9-year-old could bring to grilled cheese logistics. "Are you going to take the job?" "I don't know yet. What do you think?" She shrugged, the universal gesture of a kid who trusted the answer would be fine either way. "I think you should stop hiding just because it's easier. You always tell me that." David looked at her for a long moment, spatula still in hand, something loosening in his chest that had been tight for 8 years. "Yeah," he said. "I do tell you that." 2 weeks later, David walked back into Continental Freight Systems through the front entrance instead of the loading dock, wearing a shirt with a collar and no barcode badge, just his name printed clean on a laminated card. David Turner, Chief Technology Officer. The transition wasn't instant or dramatic. It happened in small pieces, a standing meeting every Tuesday where people actually waited for him to speak instead of speaking over him, an email signature with his real title on it, a decision to keep his old basement desk exactly as it was, not out of sentiment, but because he liked the quiet down there to think. Emily and David found their rhythm slowly, too, the way two people do when neither one wants to rush something that survived a national outage to get here. It showed up in small things, a dinner that became a standing Thursday tradition, Maddie included, because David wasn't the kind of man who separated his daughter from anything that mattered to him. Maddie, for her part, decided within the first month that Emily was fine, I guess, which from a 9-year-old was closer to a blessing than either adult let on they understood. It showed up in a hallway one evening in November, both of them staying late reviewing a routing update when Emily reached over without quite deciding to and laced her fingers through his, and he didn't let go, and neither of them made it into something bigger than it needed to be in that moment. Neither of them said anything about it the next day either. They didn't need to. "You know," Emily said, looking at the dispatch board glowing steady down on the floor below them, "the system's been stable for 6 weeks straight. Longest stretch in 2 years, according to the old logs. 12 years, David corrected. Quiet. It was always stable. Nobody just knew why." "I do now," Emily said, not looking at the board anymore, looking at him instead. David glanced over, caught the look, and let himself hold it a second longer than he might have a month ago. Down the hall, a cleaning cart rattled past, and somewhere below them, a driver in Ohio radioed in an early delivery, one small green dot on a map that no longer needed anyone to explain why it was moving. Down on the operations floor, the trucks moved on time, hub after hub, all across a country that had no idea an entire network of freight had once hinged on a man nobody thought to ask for a name. Above it, in the glow of monitors that finally matched the quiet confidence of the system underneath them, an entire infrastructure had stood for 12 years, held up by someone nobody had ever bothered to ask about. One click helps stories like David's reach more people than men like Gary ever wanted. Subscribe.